Chapter 5. The abandoned tunnel was packed with Lycans, both male and female. Hooting and hollering, they crowded the underground ruins, which were lit by erratic light of crude torches wedged here and there in crumbling brick walls. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the musky air was pungent with the smell of smoke, sweat, pheromones, and blood. The greasy unwashed clothing of Lycans added to the general stench. Anthropomorphic shadows danced wildly on the cobweb-covered walls, and gnawed white bones, human and otherwise, littered the rocky floor. Rats scuttled around the edges of the tunnel, feeding on the Lycan's grisly leavings. Empty bottles of beer and Tokay clinked loudly as they rolled between the revelers' feet. The entire scene had the riotous, unruly frenzy of Hell's Angels rally, or perhaps the 18th century of a bacchanal. Animalistic growls and snarls came from the centre of the commotion, as the riled Lycans clustered in a ring around an irresistible entertainment. Rudely josting each other for a better view, two gigantic male werewolves were locked in a fierce combat, snapping and clawing as they circled each other like enraged pit bulls. Tufts of grey-black fur went flying as the frothing beasts traded gouging slashes and bites, lunging savagely at each other. To the tumultuous delight of the crowd, fresh blood spattered the thrilled faces of the Lycan spectators, who were dwarfed by the 7-foot-tall werewolves. The fur-crested skulls of the creatures towered above the heads of the mostly humanoid audience. "Go! Get him!" in a jubilant Lycan shouted, although it was unclear which monstrous man-beast she was cheering for. "Tear him apart! That's it!" another onlooker called out loudly. Stomping his boot on the floor, a plump black rat scurried for us safely. "Don't back off! Go for his throat!" Disgraceful, Lucian thought, observing the story spectacle. With a weary sigh, he raised his shotgun. Blam! The resounding blast of the rifle cut through the echoing yells and growls like a silver blade slicing through a werewolf's heart. The obstreperous mob fell silent, and even the two battling lycanthropes halted their brutal clash. Startled eyes, both humans and lupine, turned towards the solitary figure standing at the rear of the dilapidated tunnel. Although deceptively slight in appearance, Lucian carried himself with a carriage and bearing of a true leader, the unquestioned master of the Lycan horde. He had an air of polished cultivation that his uncouth subjects sorely lacked. His expressive grey eyes, long black hair, and neatly trimmed beard and moustache gave him a look of somewhat an unbane Jesus. His hair was combed back in a widow's peak, exposing a lofty brow of Shakespearean proportions. He looked to be in his early 30s, although his true origins were lost in the impenetrable mists of history. He was also very much alive, despite his supposed death nearly 6 centuries ago. His dark brown attire was also significantly more expensive and stylish than the cheap thrift store wear that draped his subjects. The tail of his oiled leather trench coat flapped back behind him like a monarch's robes. His gloves and boots were equally slick and polished. A crest-shaped pendant hung from his chain around his neck. The gleaming medallion reflected the torchlight, throwing dazzling beams about the dimly lit catacomb. Coward Lycans edged nervously from his path as he strode confidently into the crowd, a smoking shotgun resting lightly upon his shoulder. His disapproving eyes raked across the faces of the gathered minions, who shrank back in apprehension. They bowed their heads in submission to their leader. "You're acting like a pack of rabid dogs!" he raised disdainfully, speaking Hungarian with a crisp British accent. "And that, gentlemen, simply will not do. Not if you expect to defeat the vampires on their own ground. Not if you expect to survive at all." He looked over the drooping heads of the blood-spattered spectators to where the two mighty hell beasts had been contending. "Pierce! Taylor!" The crowd parted entirely to reveal 2 human gladiators, their naked bodies slick with blood and perspiration. Nasty cuts and scratches marred their heaving chests as they panted in exhaustion. Both men looked as though they had just run a marathon through a field of thorny rose bushes, but their eyes still glowed with feral glee and rapacity. "They should have saved their predatory zeal for our foes," Lucian thought, appalled at such pointless waste of blood and energy, and the truly sad thing was that these two were his most reliable lieutenants. Cold grey eyes regarded the brawling pair with open contempt. Pierce, the tall of the two, was brawny Caucasian, whose uncombed shoulder-length black hair made him look like a comic book barbarian. Taylor, his partner, was also white, with reddish-brown hair and whiskers. They were stood stiffly at attention, their heads hunched below their shoulders, and their arms' fingers extended at their sides, as though their hands still sported dagger-like talons. Lucian shook his head. "You can take the man out of the wolf," he thought, philosophically, "but you can't take the wolf out of the man. Put some clothes on, will you?" The Ferencziak Square subway station, recently the site of so much gunfire and bloodshed, was now swarming with Hungarian police officers and forensic examiners. Like their American counterparts, the local cops were navy blue uniforms and stony hardboard expressions. Michael watched a pair of forensic assistants examine their charred remains of what looked like a burn victim. Funny, he thought, blinking in confusion. I don't remember a fire breaking out. Pale-faced and shaken, Michael leaned against a chipped and bullet-riddled support column as a chunky police officer, who had identified himself as Sergeant Ewan Yardy, took his statement. The dazed young American's pants and t-shirt were still soaked with blood. Amazingly, none of it was his own. Tattoos, scars, any other identifying marks? The cop asked, hoping for a description of the assailants. Michael shook his head. No, like I said, it happened too fast. His gaze drifted over the officer's shoulder to where a couple paramedics were strapping the injured Hungarian girl to a gurney. The unlucky teen had lost a lot of blood, but it looked as though she was probably going to make it. He breathed a sigh of relief, grateful that he had managed to keep the girl alive until help could get to her. No wonder I can't remember anything. What the shooters looked like, he thought. I was too busy dealing with a severed artery. Hinyani nodded, jotting something down in his notebook. Behind him, the medics started wheeling the girl towards the handicapped elevator. Doctor, one of the MOTs called out to Michael. If you want a ride, you better hurry. The cop glanced down at the hospital ID badge pinned to the young American's jacket. Sorry, Michael said with a shrug. Gotta run. Thank God, he thought, anxious to leave the violated subway station. He shouted back over his shoulder as I hurried after the medics. I'll give you a call if I remember anything useful. As if there were any way he could make sense of what had happened here tonight. The mansion, long known as Orderkar's Devil's House, was located about an hour north of downtown Budapest, outside the picturesque little town Szentendre, on the western bank of the Dunabi. Pounding rain still streamed down the tinted windshield of Celine's Jaguar XJR as she neared the intimidating cast-iron gates of Victor's vast estate. Mounted security cameras scoped her out thoroughly before the spiked crown gates swung open automatically. Despite the slippery conditions, the Jag raced down the long paved driveway as quickly as its driver dared. Khan and the others needed to know what had transpired in the city as soon as possible. Although Celine was not looking forward to returning without Rigel, whose blackened corpse she had been forced to leave behind, or Nathaniel, who was missing and presumed dead as well. 2 death dealers laid low in a single night, she pondered in dismay. Craven will have to take this seriously, I hope. Ordergaz loomed before her, a sprawling Gothic edifice dating back to the days when the feudal warlords ruled Hungary, with fists of iron. Jagged spires and battlements rose atop its looming stone walls, while majestic columns and pointed arches adorned its brooding facade. The lambent glow of candlelight could be glimpsed through the mansion's narrow lacent windows, suggesting that Ordergaz's lively nocturnal activities were still going strong. A circular fountain situated across the drive from the wide arched doorway sprayed a fume of churning white water into the cold night. Home sweet home, Celine thought, without much enthusiasm. Parking right outside the main entrance, she stormed up to the marble steps through the heavy oaken doors. Fledgling vampires waiting at the door offered to take her coat and gear, but she brushed past them, intent on getting the word to those who mattered. The disc from Rigel's camera rested securely in her pocket, holding vital photographic evidence of his killers. The foyer was as impressive as the mansion's exterior. Priceless tapestries and oil paintings hung around the lustrous oak-panelled walls. Marble tiles stretched across the floor where the sweeping main stairways rose majestically towards the upper reaches of Udagaz. An immense crystal chandelier glittered above the stately entry hall, welcoming Celine in from the night. Brushing aside a hanging tapestry, she stepped briskly into the grand salon, which was decorated in a tastefully subdued tones of black, red, and rich walnut brown. Lighted candelabras were mounted along the wall, hanging from the ceiling, shining down on a rose-coloured wall carpet, bearing a floral design. Ornamental brass lamps with opaque black shades rested upon antique mahogany end tables. Beneath the elaborately carved wooden mouldings running along the borders of the ceiling, heavy velvet curtains of the deepest burgundy were draped over the windows, keeping out any prying eyes to whose owners might have made it past the gates outside. A flock of well-dressed vampires loitered in the luxurious surroundings, lounging indolently on plush velvet divans or minglings in the corners, exchanging carefree giggles and gossip. The trill of high-pitched laughter mixed with the gentle clink of crystal goblets filled with an enticingly crimson beverage. Pearly white fangs peeked from the jaded smiles of elegant vampires, men and women, wearing the latest fashion from Chanel and Armani. Celine's face hardened. She had little patience with such as these, although vampires to be sure. These preening Cerebites were no deaf dealers, merely undead socialites and libertines, more interested in their own Epicurean pleasures than in the never-ending battle against the hated lycanthropes. Don't they ever know there's a war on? She thought, for maybe the millionth time. The decadent atmosphere was redolent of expensive perfume and steaming plasma, but despite the numerous bodies crowded in the salon, the temperature remained pleasantly cool. Vampires were cold-blooded by nature. Her sudden arrival attracted little notice. A few curious heads swung around at her, examining the drenched deaf dealer through bored and disinterested eyes. Before returning to a more engaging amusement, she barely caused a ripple in the flow of sophisticated chit-chat and witty repartee, working its way around the lavishly appointed chamber. No matter, Celine thought. These were not the vampires she needed to speak to. Her eyes scanned the room, hoping to locate Craven himself, but the manor's surrogate master was nowhere to be seen. A bitter smile reached her lips. If Craven was not here, presiding over the salon's festivities, then she knew where he had to be. Not for the first time Craven thanked the dark gods below, that contrary to myth and folklore, vampires were perfectly capable of admiring their reflections in the mirror. He posed bare-chested before the trifold mirror in the sumptuous private suite, which had once belonged to Victor himself. The dressing room itself was the size of a small apartment and was lavishly furnished in showy pieces of superlative quality and design. An armoire of gargantuan proportions held the regent's considerable wardrobe, while an intricate Persian rug cushioned his neatly pedicured feet. A custom-made Tiffany lamp shone overhead, allowing him a sufficient light in which to admire himself. The standing mirror offered three equally flattering views of the vampire lord's Adonis-like physique. A mane of shoulder-length black locks gave him the romantic dash of Heathcliff or Byron, while his well-built chest and biceps were impressive even by vampiric standards. Piercing black eyes looked back at him from the centre mirror, liking what they saw. Only the ruddy tint of his flesh, pinker than normal for a vampire, hinted at centuries of overindulgence. Not bad for 700 plus, he nodded with approval. Craven had been a gentleman of leisure since at least the last Renaissance. Two attractive vampire women, each less than a mortal lifetime old, and hence little more than servant wenches, attended to him diligently, seemingly just enthralled by his physical perfection and considerable manliness as he. They knelt beside him as they gently eased a pair of tailored silk trousers over first one foot, then the other. Their cool English fingers traced the rippling contours of his sculpted muscular as they raised the trouser up to his legs, then proceeded to slowly button the front of his pants from the bottom up, one delicious centimetre at a time. Trading a glance, they giggled like naughty schoolgirls. Craven basked in the servant girl's adoration. Let them have their fun, he thought magnanimously. Why shouldn't they feel privileged to wait upon the person of the lord of the manor? Was he not the preeminent vampire on the continent? And soon to be so much more. The double doors of the suite banged open, jarring him out of his blissful reverie. He turned to see Celine, of all people, barging into his privacy of his chambers. The deaf dealer's dark brown hair was soaked in most unflattering manner. Nevertheless, Craven felt a surge of lust at the sight of the striking female vampire. Too bad that, judging from her severe expression, Celine's mood tonight was something less than amorous. So, what else is new? He thought sourly. The servant girls backed away instinctively as Celine strode across the room, dripping water onto his imported Persian carpet. She reached beneath her coat and slammed a heavy object down on the lacquered top of Craven's antique walnut desk. He observed, with some disdain, and the metallic item was a firearm of some sort. Craven didn't see anything particularly noteworthy about the gun, but Celine evidently felt otherwise. Intense brown eyes locked into his. "We have a serious problem," she stated. The dojo was located on the top floor of the mansion, in a converted attic loft. Unlike the uplicant door found elsewhere in the Ordergaz, the training area was Spartan in appearance. Dedicated exclusively to the art of war, sparring mats along with soundproofed firing range occupied most of the spacious garret, while the dense stone walls supported rack after rack of exotic stabbing weapons and firearms. Silver glinted from every lethal edge and surface. Besides her own private quarters, the well-armed attic was one of the few places within the mansion where Celine felt truly comfortable. It was a place for warriors. "I would definitely have to run a few tests," Craven stated, holding up a glowing bullet with a pair of forceps. Tinted safety glasses allowed him to examine the luminous projectile close up. "But it's definitely eradicated fluid of sorts." Concerning curiosity, a light registered on the sharp, intelligent features of the Death Dealer's daunting commander and the weapons master. An imposing vampire of African descent, Khan was dressed entirely in black. His leather fighting gear matched Celine's minus the streaks of blood and the muck. He spoke English with a thick Cockney accent that he had acquired during the long stint as a slave on a merchant vessel. Khan was centuries old, his origin shrouded in mysteries. Some said that he once fought beside the great Shaka himself, while others speculated that the enigmatic Death Dealer martial arts before being initiated into vampirism. All Celine knew for sure, all she needed to know, was that Khan's commitment to the war was as unshakable as her own. Unlike the immortal delicates Celine had encountered downstairs in the salon, Khan was all business. He set the bullet down on the workbench next to the disassembled pieces of Trix's pistol. The overhead lights glinted over the ebony surface of Khan's shaved skull. Celine raised a hand to shield her eyes from the stinging radiance of the captured bullet. "Ultraviolet ammunition," she marveled aloud. "Daylight harnesses a weapon," Khan concurred, removing his tinted glasses. "And from what you described, extremely effective." Celine winced inwardly, and thoughts of Rigel's fiery demise. She still could see the corrosive beams of light exploding from his ravaged body. At least he didn't suffer long, she thought, by the way of the bitter solace. He perished within seconds. Craven, on the other hand, could not have been less interested or impressed. "You expect me to believe that a mangy animal came up with a bullet specifically engineered to kill vampires?" Looking distinctly bored, he stood alongside the workbench with Khan and Celine. He wore a dark cotton tunic with a brocade collar beneath a smart black jacket. Polished gemstones flashed from silver settings of his rings. As usual, his blasé attitude dismayed Celine. She had long suspected that Craven had once served as a Death Dealer, only to advance his own position within the Coven, in a hierarchy based largely on seniority. A reputation as a war hero provided an efficient shortcut to upper echelons of the vampire society. Slaying the infamous Lycan had made Craven's name, and at least, as far as Celine was concerned, he had been coasting on that triumph ever since, to her perpetual dismay. The vampire regent had zero patience for anything that interfered with his domestic amusements, which clearly included with his impromptu gatherings. A few meters away, lounging against an antique weapons cabinet packed with a few daggers and scimitars, two of Craven's nubile handmaidens dutifully tittered at his remarks. The servant girl's presence at a debriefing irked Celine. She had nothing against frivolous filles de charmes, who could hardly be blamed for their immaturity, but they had no business at a serial war conference. Surely Craven could have done without his worshippers for at least the length of the meeting. "No, I'm betting it's military," Khan replied, addressing Craven's sarcastic query. He nodded at the glowing UV projectile. "Some kind of high-tech tracer round." Celine found herself growing increasingly impatient. "I don't care what they got these things," she declared, not wanting to lose sight of the larger issue. "Rigel is dead and Nathaniel could still be out there. We should gather the Death Dealers and head back down there in force." It wasn't even midnight yet, she observed. There's still plenty of hours before sunshine. "Out of the question," Craven said bluntly. "Not now, not for a random incursion." He shook his head at the sheer absurdity of the notion. "The awakening is only a few days off, and this house is a state of unrest as it is." Celine couldn't believe her ears. "Random? They opened fire on us in full view of the public." That alone, she reflected, violated the unspoken rules governing the long, Twilight struggled between vampires and the Lycans. And from the commotion I heard down there in that tunnel there... You said it yourself, you didn't actually see anything, Craven interrupted her. He crossed his arms over his chest, challenging her to contradict him. Celine took a deep breath, making an effort to hold on to her temper. Like it or not, Victor had placed Craven in charge of the Coven, on the basis of historic victory in the mountains of Moldavia. This was no time for them to squabble like rival siblings. I know what I heard, she insisted coolly, and I know what my gut tells me, and I'm warning you that there could be dozens of Lycans down there in the subway tunnels. Who knows, maybe even hundreds. A hush fell over the attic at Celine's ominous pronouncement. Even the two giggling servant girls shut up and paid attention, appalled at the very notion of a Lycan horde dwelling practically underneath their noses. Craven shifted uncomfortably for the moment, before assuming a look of amused disbelief. We've hunted them down to the brink of extinction, he stated, flatly. A condescending grin slid across his face. Even Khan seemed to doubt Celine's claims. Craven's right, he assured her. There hasn't been a dang of that magnitude in centuries, not since the days of Lucian. Or so we always believed, Celine thought gloomily. I know that, Khan. She couldn't fault him for his skepticism, but I'd rather have you prove me wrong by checking it out. Khan nodded, seeing her point. He turned to Craven, seeking the other vampires okay. Craven in turn glanced impatiently at his watch. He heaved a weary sigh. Very well, he conceded. Have your men tighten up security around here. I'll have Soren assemble a search team. Soren was Craven's personal pitbull, reporting directly to him. Celine had always considered Soren more of a thug than a soldier, lacking the discipline and commitment of a true death dealer. The simmering rivalry between the dealers and Soren's goon squad had endured almost as long as the war itself. I want to lead the team myself, she declared. Absolutely not, Craven said. Soren will handle it. Celine looked to Khan, hoping that the seasoned commander would insist that the death dealer take charge of the investigation, but the African vampire declined to challenge Craven's decree. He must think this is not worth fighting over for, she realized. Disappointed by Khan's apparent lack of faith in her instincts. Perhaps emboldened by Khan's silence, Craven couldn't resist gloating a bit. Hundreds, really, he scoffed, shaking his head in the most patronizing manner. Celine stood her ground. Victor would have believed me, she announced icily, before turning her back on Craven and storming out the door. If only Victor were truly among us once more, she thought anxiously, her fixed expression concealing a growing sense of apprehension. How can it be that our safety in future depends on an insufferable egotist like Craven? The target of her contempt was rendered speechless by Celine's brazen impertinence. How dare she walk unto me like this, Craven thought, seething with indignation, and invoke the name of Victor no less. I am the lord of the manor, now, not our slumbering sire. Craven glared at Celine's retreating fawn. Khan diplomatically refrained from commenting on the female death dealer's abrupt departure. Nonetheless, Craven felt both slighted and humiliated. His brain searched frantically for some withering witticism to help him save face. To his surprise, one of the hovering servant girls came slinking up to him, laying a hand gently on his arm. I would never dream of treating you that, she cooed, seductively, brushing a finger up and down his arm, an obvious invitation for anything he might desire. Craven glanced down at the clinging vampiress. In fact, he had all but forgotten about the two underlings' presence, but now he took a closer look at the simpering maid, serving at his side. She was slim, blonde thing, with violet eyes, and a sleuth-like figure that was scarcely hidden by a sequined black frock and long black gloves. A lacy black choker encircled her neck, offering a veiled glimpses of her jugular. What is her name again? Craven pondered absently. He had dim memories of initiating her at a nightclub in Piccadilly less than 30 years ago. Ah yes, Erica. She pressed a tender form against him, basking in his attention. Her adoring eyes promised him absolute devotion and obedience, in both body and soul. Of course she wouldn't, he informed her bluntly, his dismissive tone striking the love-struck vampiress like a slap across the face. To think she had the audacity to offer me the blind allegiance that is already mine by right. His wounded pride took some comfort in the crushed, chastened expression on the silly tart's face. At least I can still put someone in her place around here, he thought bitterly. He coolly detached her arm from his. Now, run along. and make sure Celine's dressed and ready for the arrival of our very important guests." Erica crept away meekly, choking back a heartbroken sob. Craven watched her slip submissively down the stairs, accompanied by her less presumptuous sister in servitude. If only Celine could be so more obliging, he thought wistfully, in every respect.